After tweeting about Tuesday's primaries, President Trump posted about what he calls fake news. On Wednesday, he said the fake news is working overtime and suggested taking away journalists' credentials. The president often tweets about the press, but another man has been calling out the media for decades. Brent Bozell started the Media Research Center more than 30 years ago. Tim Alberta examined his influence on the right's war on the press for Politico Magazine. Here's what Alberta recently told me about how the group came about.
Brent Bozell was sort of at the tip of the spear back in the late 1980s when a lot of conservatives felt as though the media had been sort of infiltrated and taken over by liberals, folks who were personally and professionally antagonistic towards their worldview and towards their belief systems, and they felt as though something needed to be done to combat this perceived bias that had become, in their minds, very prevalent in the mainstream media. And so they created this group, the Media Research Center, at first, with the purpose of holding the media accountable and highlighting instances of this perceived bias and attempting to sort of catalog it in a way that they could look back to specific examples and cite it as something of an academic exercise instead of just complaining in the abstract at cocktail parties or with conversations with various reporters around town about, we think the media is biased against conservatives. They wanted to actually have research, empirical evidence on their hands that they could use, and it became a very effective strategy to sort of rally conservatives against the media starting, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and it's so interesting in your piece how you go through the evolution of this organization. Does Bozell believe now, decades later, that the organization has achieved its goals?
Well, it's another complicated question because he would tell you that he would love to retire and that he would like to go sit on the beach somewhere because the goal is to, originally was to fix the media, was to eradicate this perceived bias and have the media just calling balls and strikes. And if, Bozell told me that he would have loved to have gotten to that place where he felt like the media had sort of self-corrected and that he could shut down the organization once and for all, feeling like it was mission accomplished. He says that that never happened. But I think the truth is probably a little bit more complicated. Media bashing has become very fashionable on the right. It's also become very lucrative on the right. And Brent Bozell, among others, has made an awful lot of money beating up on the media over the years. And that's not to say that they don't believe in what they're doing. I think there are lots of people who believe in what they're doing, but their mission also can evolve over time when they come to realize just how financially beneficial some of this can be in the world of politics especially. So I think that on the one hand, Bozell and some of his allies would acknowledge that they have succeeded in their mission because they have brought heightened awareness to the perceived bias that exists in the mainstream media. But I think on the other hand, they would say that they have failed because in their view, the media today is more hostile towards conservatism than it was 30 years ago when they first started this organization.
Well, calls of so-called fake news seem louder now more than ever. How has that impacted Bozell's group?
Well, I think that for starters, it's important to understand that when Donald Trump came on the scene in 2016, he did not create this war on the media. He was not really a pioneer in beating up on the press. I think what Donald Trump did quite masterfully was exploit the conditions that had been created for several decades before he arrived on the scene. And I think when you have individuals like Brent Bozell and organizations like the Media Research Center, and frankly, a lot of conservative viewers and readers at home who have never even heard of the Media Research Center, but who are certainly receptive to this idea that the media is in fact biased against them. I think you have these conditions created where somebody like Donald Trump can come along and rather than just pointing a finger at the media and accusing them of bias, he could take it to another level. He can accuse the media of actively deceiving the American people and, moreover, of being the enemies of the American people, as the president himself said. And he has found a very receptive audience, again, because that groundwork had been laid decades ago. And really, Elaine, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that some of this, a lot of this, predates Brent Bozell and the Media Research Center. You have a rich history of conservative conservative politicians and conservative activists going back to the 1950s who believed that it was fundamental to their task in succeeding in the political arena and in the competition of ideas for them to neutralize what they believed was an antagonistic media that was out to help the Democratic Party and out to help liberals defeat conservatives.
Well, what do fellow conservatives think of the work Bozell has done? Because one of the things that struck me about your piece is sort of the range of views among conservatives about Bozell.
Yeah, I think the evolution that I was just discussing has caught a lot of conservatives off guard because there are an awful lot of folks on the right who share those baseline beliefs that the mainstream media kind of structurally is left of center, and that most of the journalists who work in the major national newsrooms are themselves culturally left of center. But that belief in and of itself does not necessarily precipitate a more aggressive belief that these people in the media are actively trying to deceive readers or viewers, and that they are a hostile force that needs to be neutralized. I think that as with so much else in the conservative world, things have really changed and accelerated over the last 10 to 15 years, kind of from the post-George W. Bush era, the twilight of the Bush presidency, to present day. There's been an enormous change in the Republican Party over the last 10 years, and this much more aggressive attitude towards the media, I think, is a big part of that. And many of the conservatives I spoke with acknowledged exactly that and said, frankly, look, you know, I think we may have kind of unwittingly created a monster here because this fake news thing is really dangerous. It has enormous implications that go far beyond just our initial belief, again, that yes, the media is left of center, and yes, we need to push back and we need to combat these perceived biases because it's important to make sure that we have a politically fair and neutral and objective print and broadcast media. But that has turned into something very different, and I think there are a lot of folks on the right who are concerned about that. Finally,
Tim, what does Brent Bozell think of President Trump? Because you point out he was not supportive initially of Donald Trump's candidacy for the presidency.
Yeah, and that's something that quite a few folks brought up to me, and I was well aware of that fact. Obviously, Brent Bozell was a prominent Trump critic during the 2016 campaign because he himself was supporting Ted Cruz. And when the National Review published its Against Trump issue featuring a whole bunch of essays from various conservatives, prominent conservatives, describing why they were uncomfortable with Donald Trump and opposed to his candidacy, Brent Bozell wrote this very tough piece about how Trump was a charlatan, and he went on Fox News saying much of the same and saying, God help us if this guy becomes president. So I think for a lot of folks in the media, when Bozell then pivoted towards the general election after his own candidate, Cruz, had lost the nomination, and suddenly Bozell retrained all of his fire back on the media and accused the media of being unfair to Trump and hostile to Trump, I think that caught a lot of folks off guard and sort of highlighted some of the irony here inherent in this entire situation, that a group like the Media Research Center, and specifically a lot of folks like Brent Bozell, who themselves were very uncomfortable with Donald Trump and who were pretty aggressive in noting his inconsistencies and his untruths, that those same people now are calling out the media for the media highlighting those same things.
It's a fascinating read with a lot of different layers. Tim Alberta, thanks very much.